Sam Seder on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome with Emma Vigeland, Neil Kraus, professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls, author of The Fantasy Economy, Neoliberalism, Inequality, and the Education Reform Movement. Neil, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me.
These are three things that we love to talk about here on the show, and you've got them all together in the. But let's start with the fantasy that we have been sold, and then we'll talk about sort of why it's been created.
Sure. The fantasy economy is basically a misleading version of the economy and the education system in the interests of corporations and the wealthy. I trace it to the 1980s primarily. The Reagan administration really plays a significant role in the book, but over the decades, it's sort of been ramped up, and now in higher education, it's kind of like the air we breathe. There's sort of two overarching claims. One is the education system is always failing, and two, that the workforce is always inadequate. It's never good enough, right? And these two claims are just repeated endlessly by corporations, by foundations, by education reformers, and to the point where it's pretty much all we hear. For a long time, it was really directed at K-12, like the Reagan folks and Nation at Risk and all that stuff. But then since the Great Recession, it's really the pressure's been ratcheted up against higher ed. So, if you ask anybody who works in higher ed, I mean, they will tell you that this is all we hear, that we're letting the public down, that the public has lost faith in us, that our graduates don't have the right skills, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how I see it. Yeah. So
to be specific, what we're talking about is when the economy is not working for people, and when we have raised unemployment in particular, it has been a function of mismatched skill sets and having to retrain or to make our is this created to protect the economy, or is it created to essentially attack our system of education, largely public education, even if we're talking about higher ed?
More so the latter, but because really it's been the foundation of the whole education reform movement. I mean, if you convince pretty much everybody involved, I mean, much of this is targeted at the education establishment, targeted at the media, the notion that, the schools are failing, higher ed is failing. But what I argue in the book that it's much, much bigger than that. It was really a mythical account of the economy, of the labor market, that was kind of, created in order to impose a very unpopular neoliberal order. I mean, if you think about, I grew up in upstate New York. I'm from Syracuse, and I lived in Buffalo. I went to grad school in Albany, and I grew up during the 80s when, industry was just going away almost weekly, right? If you think about what's happening, right, industry is basically going overseas. Unions are under a constant assault. And what I argue in the book is that really starting with the Reagan folks, the policymakers and business interests and eventually foundations start to say, well, the real problem here is that the education system is failing. That's why industry is leaving. That's why wages are stagnant. That's why unemployment, 30 years ago was 8, 9, 10%, right? That's why you haven't gotten a raise in X number of years. It has nothing to do with business, right? It has nothing to do with the economy. It has everything to do with education. So I think that's really the primary motivation, because you can't go to Syracuse, where I grew up, in 1985 and give a speech and say, guess what? We're going to ship all your jobs overseas. We're going to fight all minimum wage increases. We're going to do everything we can to destroy labor unions. Vote for us. I mean, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. So what what really the Reagan folks and the business community kind of march lockstep, and they say, well, there's all these jobs that require a high level of skill, and so it's up to the education system to really shape people's livelihoods, and so since that time, the entire discussion of economic opportunity in the United States, the entire mainstream discussion, has been solely focused on the education system. And that's right up until the present day. So now it's up to us. It's up to higher ed, right? To basically, give people middle-class security and all the rest of it. And, what I argue in the book throughout is that we can't do that. The education system can't create jobs. It can't give people raises. It can't do any of those things. We educate and we put students out into the world, and some do really well, others don't. And who gets blamed? We get blamed. Higher ed gets blamed. That's how the politics of the fantasy economy work. Always, always, always put it back on the education system and deflect away from business and policymakers and institutions and basically anything else. It's always up to the education system. And that's why we're seen as chronically failing, because we've been assigned something that we can't do. Right?
I mean, there's an analog. I mean, you write, largely about higher ed, but there's an analog with K through 12 too, in the sense that it's supposed to, K through 12 is supposed to supersede our poverty and social ills. Right. Instead of addressing those directly, it is about the education. The elementary schools are failing, rather than look at, well, the real problem is before the kids get to the front door, essentially, because everything is written in stone. I mean, largely written in stone, maybe a slight exaggeration, but certainly incredibly predictable based upon what the social situation is and economic situation is of those kids.
Yeah, and what I discovered during the course of the research is really, in the 70s and into the 80s, there was still kind of a mainstream debate about, can we, on one side, was, well, schools can't overcome poverty. Right. They can't overcome the hardships of poverty. That was a mainstream position that had a lot of defenders in much of, conventional debate. But then the other side has always been, well, no, it's really about the schools. It's about the teachers. And if we just fix the schools and had higher standards and all the rest of it, then all children can learn, and all these sorts of things that, on the surface, you can't. Who can object to that, right? Who could disagree with that? But the former argument kind of lost in political terms, right? And the argument that the schools could somehow magically overcome poverty, even though it really doesn't square with common sense, I think, kind of won in policy circles, right? That no, we have to hold everybody to high standards, right? And if we're not trying to educate, the lowest income students to the best of our ability, we're abdicating our responsibility and so forth. But the fact is, as you point out, I mean, the schools can overcome poverty and the hardship that accompanies it, and kids who come from low income households and are food insecure households and move quite frequently, because that's what happens with lower income students. They move oftentimes, new schools, change teachers and all the rest of it. But yet schools are somehow magically supposed to overcome all that stuff and then fix it. And by the time they graduate, these students will be ready to go to college. It's really kind of a denial of the whole, context of what poverty is, I think.
And so is this I want just so we can move past the genesis. It feels like there's a quality to this, to quote Paul Wolfowitz, when he was talking about the weapons of mass destruction, it was the one thing we could all agree on. Because on one hand, it is education is blamed, our poor education is blamed to basically cover up for decisions that we make as a society within our economy. We're going to allow companies to leave. We're going to disempower unions. We're going to not raise the minimum wage. We're going to, not tax wealthy people and redistribute the wealth. Whatever, all these political decisions we make, they instead of having an awareness that we're making these political decisions, we blame the failure of the economy not working for everybody on education. At the same time, there is a very healthy anti-public education, or public school, I should say, movement in this country, which is also joined by both like very religious people and by people who just don't, I think there's some racist foundation for it. Public education is a function of Reconstruction and is a way to address sort of inequalities that came about via slavery in many respects. There's that assault. So it's almost like education is being attacked from both sides.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's different, kind of wings here to the education reform movement. They're kind of the libertarian interests that you're talking about that are very hostile to the whole concept of public education. And they've pushed, school vouchers for decades, and austerity in higher ed, is sort of a priority. But then there's sort of, what I would call neoliberal foundations that are less opposed necessarily to at least ostensibly to public education, but are always criticizing it. They and basically, trying to reform it. Charter schools are seen as kind of a solution, according to, a lot of folks in that camp. But at the end of the day, they share a very common set of policy goals and interests: hostility to organized labor, and basically just a support of what we would call sort of the neoliberal consensus, and basically a desire to kind of put the whole thing on the schools. So there are important differences. You're right. I mean, and there's a lot of very hostile forces that are kind of going after public education, for sure.
Let's talk about some of those, I guess that latter group, and this was really sort of came out of the aughts, if I remember correctly, where, George Bush had no child left behind. And this notion of, the soft bigotry of low expectations that existed, and the corporate reform movement. And then we ultimately saw that with so it's the Gates Foundation, and then Arne Duncan under the Obama administration, sort of carrying this corporate reform movement forward, all of which, it seems to me, and this, I guess I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but in some respects, it feels like we are in a post-corporate education reform movement era, and arguably maybe a little bit early soon to say this, but a post-neoliberal, at least, in terms of it is not as dominant of an idea that it used to be, let's say, 5 years ago. Would you agree with? Take both those because they're separate things, but maybe they go hand in hand.
So are you suggesting, like with the latter point, post neoliberal? You mean the big picture, basically? You're talking.
Yes, I'm saying in terms of an era. Certainly the corporate reform movement seems to. Education reform, K through 12. Seems to have died, and we're in sort of a post era of that. And I maybe I peg that to like the Rand Corporation saying that the Gates Foundation experiment was a disaster, et cetera, et cetera. But
I would also just maybe add another wrinkle too, which is this new focus on trade schools potentially being a part of that new. I don't know if that's what you were alluding to, Sam, at all, but
not necessarily trade schools, but just broadly speaking. I think like education is sort of like things like standardized tests and whatnot. Are we past that era? And maybe it's a good opportunity to talk about those as well.
I think there's a couple things to think about. I'm reminded, and I know you had John Shelton on the show, his book, The Education Myth. John and I talk about, are we on the verge of sort of a paradigm change here beyond neoliberalism? It's the consensus is at least being questioned a bit more. I mean, unions are polling very high among the public, and I think people realize, hey, the last 40 years haven't gone very well for a lot of people.
Right.
I think I mean, there's all sorts of books, nonfiction authors and journalists have written these great books in the last 5 to 10 years about the last 40 years, and sort of reinterpreting a lot of it, beginning with the Reagan administration. So I think that they're the beginnings of that right now are kind of happening. Where it goes from here, I'm not quite sure, but the emphasis, I think Emma mentioned, trade schools. I mean, there's some segments of corporate America that are kind of pushing that concept quite a bit. They seem a little bit at odds with the mainstream view among reformers, and that is everybody has to get a college degree. That's still really, post high school education. This is what I talk about in the book throughout. That is still the larger goal of most, not all, but most education reformers is that in order to move ahead, you really have to go, to school beyond high school and get a degree or whatever.
That's why I brought up trade schools, right? Which is perhaps we're in this era of, when you're the myth of education essentially solving for poverty and all these societal ills that the government needs to be involved in. There's this kind of renewed focus on education as a funnel into economic usefulness under capitalism, and somebody that can be a pliant worker or somebody that's going to provide value, as opposed to the more holistic, enriching elements of that. And I feel like even though trade schools obviously are a good thing, that kind of new, let's move towards this being the goal of higher education is a bit of an extension of, that kind of myth that you describe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, higher ed is as we speak all around the country, being turned more and more into, we have to adopt more STEM programs, even though there's very few STEM jobs. And that's not top secret. I mean, it's not like I'm the first person to write about that. This is not like confidential information, the nature of the labor market. And this is why I wrote the book. I started looking up all this official labor market data, and I'm like, wait a minute now. The economy is dominated by low education, low skill, low wage jobs. And we can't change that. The education system can't change that. No matter how many people we crank out, we can't change that. And yet we're blamed for people's economic problems. But yeah, I mean, around the country right now, I mean, I work in the University of Wisconsin system. There are many states that have state surpluses, right? West Virginia University got a lot of attention recently in the national press. West Virginia is a state with a state surplus, and what's happening? They're basically gutting the flagship university there. Not even, there's not even a possibility of using a state surplus to sort of shore up, as Emma was talking about, sort of broad-based education, because it's been narrowed to the point where pretty much the whole discussion is basically. You go to college to get a job, end of story. Mm-hmm. And higher ed doesn't do, we're a huge part of the problem. And one of the things I keep talking about is higher ed has to talk about higher ed differently. We have to talk about the purposes of education differently. Because basically what higher ed does, for the most part, almost entirely, is just echo the language of workforce development and all this kind of stuff. And that just feeds into this larger narrative that the education system is responsible for your livelihood. So we have to fix the education system, not the larger economy.
Can we figure out how? Can you walk us through how that gets unraveled? Because it seems to me that this whole notion of selling higher ed as a tool to. As a vocational tool, is really entrenched. Like it has become like so enmeshed with the mission of these institutions, both private and public. And there's been this sort of race to the bottom in terms of what an education is supposed to do, like as opposed, like very narrowly tailored, but this also sort of this arms race as to like, because it is strictly the output is to sort of create a more to make someone more rich, essentially.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That what the universities have been pursuing are sort of like consumer benefits to, while you get yourself in a position to get a better job. Do you follow what I'm saying in terms of like where the investments are going are less in sort of the wide range of educational opportunities and more in what's going to pay off?
Yeah. And that's what higher ed markets. Those, we market programs that we think will draw more students, that we think will give students a better economic opportunity. But the thing is, you can't create more jobs for engineers or anybody else by graduating more engineering majors. That's not how things work, right? And yet we operate on this very flawed assumption. I'll defend higher ed for a minute. I mean, why do we do all this? Because this, what I call the fantasy economy, and this is all we have heard. I mean, all we hear, right, within higher ed, is that we are blowing it. That our graduates are not skilled enough. That if you see one of your graduates working at Target, it's because we failed. It's not because of structural realities in the economy, right? And that's why, we're just stuck in this paradigm that really is incredibly misleading about the nature of the labor market, and has given higher ed this responsibility that at the end of the day we can't fulfill. And so what happens over a period of decades is the public, understandably, blames us. They blame, if you're 30 or 35 or 40 and you don't like your and you have a degree and you're working in a job that doesn't pay you much, where does conventional wisdom, go? Well, you went to the wrong school, or you majored in the wrong thing, or maybe, and we don't want to say this out loud too often, maybe it's something about you, right? It's not about, well, are there enough jobs for college graduates? And the answer is no. It's not about, well, a lot of jobs for college graduates have had stagnant wages for decades. It's not about that. No, we don't want to talk about that and the forces that create that, the policies that create that. We want to talk about your local English department and how it's blowing it, right? But wait, better yet, let's get rid of English. Let's add more STEM. I mean, that's pretty much the debate on every campus. With the exception of elite schools and flagships, right. They're sort of above the fray. But the rest of us, which is by far the majority, are very much in the fray. And we're getting our budgets cut when our states have record state surpluses because the public has basically blamed us because that's what they've been told to do, to blame higher ed if you're not in a good place at age 30 or 35 with your 4-year degree. Because we make them a promise, right? We make students a promise that we can't deliver. We can't deliver middle-class security to everybody with a degree. We can't create jobs for graduates, but somehow magically we're supposed to do that, right? But because of the strength of all these myths, this is why we're getting killed politically. This is why.
But who's the we here? Because it seems to me that, largely, I mean, it is the forces that would obscure the fact that that we have a political economy as opposed to an economy. I mean, so I mean, who is we being essentially citizens? In that reference, I meant we being higher education itself, but also, I mean, you could say citizens as well. I mean, most students go to public institutions. Over 70% of students go to public institutions. So, when austerity is implemented over a period of decades and public higher ed becomes tuition driven, who gets blamed for the student loan crisis?
Your local English department does, right? and not the state legislature, which has 1 year at a time scaled back its contribution and basically compelled students to borrow $50 and $60 and $70,000 for a 4-year degree from a public university today.
Have you, do you know of like a definitive piece? I mean, because my sense is that really this has been the story of the incredible inflation we've seen in higher education, that it's, there's been upward pressure because low cost public institutions that cost virtually nothing or nothing 40 or 50 years ago,
right.
Now as their cost goes up, private institutions also just, have basically are off to the races in terms of how far up they can raise their tuition. What's the most definitive, like sort of reckoning of that?
Reckoning meaning what?
Just recording of it. I mean, analysis of it, if you're aware of one.
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, there are snippets really all over the place. I can't give you a citation off the top of my head. I just know that, that it has happened over a period of decades. And rather than, typically rather than look at carefully why it's happened and look at why are we implementing austerity when we have all this fiscal prosperity in higher ed, we debate all kinds of things on campuses that really, and by the way, I think I'm not at all suggesting that higher ed spends money in a way that I would agree with, because that's not the case. I mean, we never turn down consultants. We can't turn down consultants. We can't not buy software. We have to purchase every software product because they're all game changers, even though the game never changes. And so I'm not suggesting at all that higher ed is doing everything correctly. I mean, it's not. But the fact is that over all these years, when the states have scaled back their contribution, it's on students, and they end up borrowing more and more. But wages aren't going up. So their standard of living is going to suffer.
How has this argument changed? Like, we're living in an era now where it has become, for many years, we were told that there is a natural rate of unemployment, that the economy could not sustain an unemployment rate below, I don't know, at one point it was like 6%.
Yeah, I think I was going to say 5%, but yeah, something like that.
And 5%. And now, and it's clear that is not the case. Like, we have learned that the sort of iron laws of economics that we were told was like more permanent than meteorology, I guess, are not the case. How has that had any created? I mean, because theoretically, right, if we're down at 3% unemployment, then we should be trumpeting the success of our education system. Theoretically, but of course, I mean, it has nothing to do with that. But what has it changed the tenor of the debate at all?
That's interesting because I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and unemployment quite regularly was 7, 8, 9%, 10%, right? I mean, it fluctuated, and that was always the biggest indicator, right? I mean, that was the lead story when the new numbers came out, was the unemployment rate. Now, if you think about it, the jobs report, the top line is the story. Right. Came out last week, 220 or 240,000 jobs or whatever. Right. And then the second or third line is like, unemployment's 3.3% or something. I mean, we have, I don't know what's going on. I think that the economics has yet to catch up with the fact that the unemployment rate doesn't appear to be much of an indicator anymore. There are tons of jobs. And most people seeking work have them. That results in a very low unemployment rate. But that's not translating into, improving lots of people's standard of living. It's just not, and I think that's a pretty significant story too, how the unemployment rate itself doesn't appear to be nearly the indicator that it was 30 and 40 yeyears ago.
It sort of feels like nobody's attempting to address that question whatsoever in our politics.
I would agree. And I mean, President Biden and his people, have to acknowledge that yes, the unemployment rate is low, but lots of folks aren't benefiting from that. Several decades ago, I mean, the president's reelection, whoever it was, depended on the unemployment rate largely. And if it was really low, if it went down, the president incumbent would maybe get reelected. And if it went up, and the opposite would happen. That isn't how things work, these days. And to the extent that we're focusing on that and not on wages and, people's income, that's not helpful. That's not helpful. It's not really helping the debate, in my opinion.
Neil Kraus, professor of political science, University of Wisconsin, River Falls. The book is The Fantasy Economy, Neoliberalism, Inequality, and the Education Reform Movement. We'll put a link to that in our podcast and YouTube description and at majority.fm. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks so much.